The wind had a voice that night, a low, endless hum that carried stories of those who once tried to outwalk sorrow. Evelyn May Cartwright pressed her shawl tighter against her shoulders, though it did little to keep the cold from her bones. Snow swirled around her boots as if the earth itself wished to swallow her and the small child she carried in her arms. Clara slept against her chest, her breath soft, her fingers curled into the worn flannel Evelyn used to shield her from the wind. Ahead, faint lights flickered. Hollow Bend, a town neither kind nor cruel, only watchful. The wagon tracks were half buried now, ghostly lines leading into a place that had once been her home and later her ruin. Evelyn paused at the ridge overlooking the valley. Smoke curled from chimneys, amber windows glowing like distant promises. Somewhere down there, people were warm, fed, and known by name. She, on the other hand, was a woman who carried only silence, the preacher's daughter who ran away, the wife whose husband died in a mining accident no one cared to remember, the mother trying to convince herself she could start again. By the time she reached Main Street, the snow had turned to ice, hooves clopped against the cobblestones. A lantern swung outside the inn. Evelyn hesitated before pushing the door open, the heat inside striking her face with the kind of tenderness that made her ache. Heads turned. Conversations stilled. Martha Hensley, the innkeeper, looked up from behind the counter, a woman of sharp chin and sharper memory. Her eyes narrowed. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, her voice heavy with recognition. "Evelyn Cartwright, or whatever name you're using now." Evelyn's breath hitched. "Just a room for the night, Mrs. Hensley. My daughter's cold." The woman's gaze slid to Clara, then back to Evelyn. "I run a decent establishment," she said. "I don't house uncertainty." The word struck harder than a slap. Evelyn swallowed. "I can pay." "I'm sure you can," Martha replied, turning the ledger. "But Hollow Bend hasn't forgotten what it knows. Best try the old church barn. You'll find room there, if the Lord still keeps his house open to your kind." Laughter rippled through the room, low, polite, poisonous. Evelyn turned, her eyes burning but dry. She stepped back into the storm, her daughter's whimper muffled against her coat. The door shut behind her with a finality that sounded like judgment itself. She walked through the sleeping town, her boots crunching in rhythm with the ache in her chest. At the far edge of Hollow Bend, the church stood like an abandoned sentinel, its steeple black against the snow. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and forgotten hymns. Evelyn found the barn out back, its roof half collapsed, the straw stiff with frost. She laid Clara down beside a small pile of hay and struck a match. The brief flare illuminated her daughter's pale face, the same soft jaw as her father's, the same eyes that still believed in light. When the match died, darkness returned like an old friend. Evelyn curled around Clara, whispering the only lullaby she remembered. "The Lord is my shepherd." But the words fractured halfway through. It had been so long since faith felt like something she could touch. Morning came gray and brittle. The cold gnawed at her fingers until they felt carved from wood. She ventured into town with a scarf tied low over her face, hoping anonymity could buy her a few coins worth of dignity. At the general store, she sold her last silver locket, the one keepsake from her mother, for bread and matches. The clerk counted the coins without looking at her, his silence louder than any insult. Outside, Clara chased falling snowflakes, her laughter a sound so pure it turned heads. Evelyn smiled faintly, then noticed the whispers begin again. A pair of women by the well turned their backs, voices low and tight. She didn't need to hear the words. She had heard them all before. "That's her," they said without saying it. "The preacher's shame." She left quickly, clutching the bread to her chest. By dusk, the town's gossip had already taken flight, moving faster than the wind. That evening, as Evelyn tried to repair the hole in her daughter's shoe with an old thread and shaking fingers, she heard hooves crunching outside. She froze. The barn door creaked open. A tall figure stepped in, lantern in hand. Snow scattered off his coat as he lowered his hat. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Storm's coming." Saw the smoke. Thought someone might be stuck. Evelyn rose, wary. "We're fine," she said. The man's gaze flicked to Clara, then to the threadbare blanket. "Fine, don't look like that, ma'am. I don't need your pity." "Didn't offer any," he said simply, crouching to check the lantern. "Just help." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hiss of snow against the barn walls. He introduced himself as Silas Boone, cowhand from the northern ridge, delivering supplies before the storm trapped the roads. His words were plain, but his manner carried the quiet assurance of someone who understood loneliness too well to fear it. She thanked him without meeting his eyes, and he tipped his hat before leaving. But as he mounted his horse, he glanced back once, just a flicker. and in that look was something neither pity nor judgment. It was recognition, as if he'd seen this story before, maybe even lived it. The next morning, Evelyn found a small bundle of firewood by the barn door. No note, just the clean, dry scent of pine. She stared at it for a long time, her breath trembling in the air. Clara squealed when the fire caught, clapping her hands as warmth filled the barn. "The kind man brought it," she said. Evelyn said nothing, but inside her chest something uncurled. A faint, foolish gratitude. Days passed in the rhythm of survival. Evelyn began stitching gloves from scraps of cloth, trading them in town for flour. She avoided the inn, avoided the stairs, spoke to no one. At night, she would watch Clara sleep, her small hand resting on the wooden floor, and wonder what kind of life she'd dragged her daughter into. One afternoon, as she walked to the river to wash their clothes, she saw Silas again. He was mending a broken fence by the water's edge, sleeves rolled, his breath visible in the chill. He nodded when he saw her, nothing more. Yet when her basket tipped and the wet clothes spilled into the snow, he was beside her in an instant, wordless, helping her gather them. His gloved hands were rough but careful. When they finished, he gave a small smile. "River's colder than it looks," he said. "I've known colder," she replied. Something passed between them then. Quiet understanding. A kinship born from hurt rather than hope. Silas said nothing more, only lifted the basket onto his horse and carried it as far as the barn for her. When he set it down, he looked at her as if to speak, then thought better of it. "Keep the road clear," he said, and left. That night, Evelyn sat awake long after Clara slept. She thought of the way he'd handled the frozen linen, the small nod of respect he'd given her. She didn't trust it. Kindness was the cruelest trick life had ever played on her. It always came before loss. Winter deepened. The river froze solid. Hollow Bend seemed to shrink into itself. Its people huddled close to fires, their hearts colder than the snow outside. Rumors wound through every chimney. Martha Hensley told anyone who'd listen that Evelyn was living off a man's charity, that the preacher's daughter hadn't changed a bit. Evelyn ignored it, though each word found its way to her somehow, carried by glances and unfinished sentences. Still, Silas kept showing up. Sometimes he brought nails for the roof, other times a loaf of bread. He never stayed long, never crossed the fragile line she kept between them. But when he spoke to Clara, kneeling so their eyes met, his voice softened in a way Evelyn hadn't heard from a man in years. One evening, when the wind howled so fiercely it seemed the sky itself might tear, there came another knock on the barn door. Silas stood there, snow thick in his beard, holding a pot of stew and 2 blankets. "You'll freeze before morning," he said. Evelyn hesitated. Pride wrestled with need. The fire was nearly out. Clara's lips had turned pale. She opened the door wider. "Just for tonight," she whispered. He nodded once and stepped inside. The stew smelled of thyme and smoke, and Clara ate as though she hadn't tasted warmth in weeks. Silas said little, only watched the fire catch again and listened to the wind outside. Evelyn caught herself studying the lines on his face, the tired grace of a man who had known loss and carried it quietly. When the child drifted to sleep, Silas spoke softly. "Nobody ought to weather winter alone." Evelyn looked into the fire, her throat tightening. "Some of us don't have a choice." He met her gaze. "There's always a choice, just not always an easy one." The flames painted their faces gold, flickering over the scars of 2 lives stitched by silence. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, the air held stillness, a fragile, unspoken peace. Evelyn didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The gratitude lived in the quiet between them. As the night deepened, the sound of the wind softened to a whisper. Evelyn lay down beside her daughter, her eyes on the dying fire. For the first time in years, the darkness didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like shelter, like a pause between one life ending and another just beginning. And somewhere beyond the snow and silence, she thought she heard the faintest promise in the wind's song. Something about names lost and names found again. She closed her eyes, letting that promise carry her into sleep, unaware that the stranger by the fire had already decided that winter would not take her. Not this time. By the time the thaw began, Evelyn had forgotten what color the world was beneath snow. Weeks passed like slow hours. The barn smelled of smoke and horses, and a life pieced together from what others had thrown away. Silas came most evenings, never announced, never expected, bringing quiet conversation, small repairs, and the kind of company that did not demand anything in return. Sometimes he spoke of cattle runs or weather, but more often they shared silence, and somehow that said more. Clara adored him. She would wait at the door each dusk, listening for the distant sound of hooves. When he appeared, she would run to meet him, her laughter scattering through the brittle air. Evelyn watched their bond grow with a mixture of wonder and fear. She had built her life around caution, yet every smile Clara gave him chipped at the walls she'd so carefully built. The gossip, however, never slept. Martha Hensley told the church ladies that the preacher's daughter had found a new savior in trousers. The sheriff began to visit, asking too many questions about how long Evelyn intended to squat on church land. Hollow Bend had rules for women like her, rules written in whispers and upheld in stares. Silas knew it too, but he didn't stop coming. His defiance wasn't loud. It lived in gestures: a repaired hinge, a loaf of bread left on the step, a small wooden horse he carved for Clara when her doll broke. One afternoon, Evelyn found Silas mending the corral fence near the edge of town. The sun hung low, spilling gold over the snowbanks. She hesitated, then walked up to him, her breath misting in the cold. "You shouldn't keep coming here," she said softly. "People are talking." "They always talk," he answered without looking up. "Doesn't mean they're right. They'll turn on you too." He straightened, eyes gentle but steady. "Let 'em. I don't answer to tongues." Evelyn shook her head. "I don't want to be anyone's burden." "Then don't be," he said. "Be someone's reason." She didn't understand what he meant. Not fully, but his voice lingered long after he rode away. That night, she found the small wooden bird he'd left on the table beside Clara's blanket. Its wings were spread, ready to fly, though it would never leave the ground. She ran her thumb over the carved feathers and felt something inside her soften, a feeling dangerously close to hope. But hope has a way of testing the faithful. It was the sheriff who came first, his boots crunching in the frost. "Miss Cartwright," he said, drawing out the syllables as though her name itself were suspect. "Council's decided it's improper for you to be staying here without income or family. Spring's near. You'll move along before it comes." Evelyn's spine straightened. "And if I don't, then I'll find reason enough to make you." His eyes gleamed with the power of a man who enjoyed his work. "You've had charity enough." When he left, the barn felt smaller, the air sharper. Clara sat by the fire, humming softly, unaware that the walls of their small safety had just begun to crack. Evelyn pressed her palms to her face and tried to remember the prayer her father had taught her for courage. Only silence came. Silas arrived that evening, snow melting from his coat. He saw her expression before she spoke. "They came, didn't they? They said I have to leave before spring." He stared at the fire, jaw tight. "You won't." "I can't stay where I'm not wanted." His eyes lifted to hers. "Then stay where you are needed." Evelyn wanted to believe him, but she had learned that words, even kind ones, had sharp edges. She said nothing. Later, when Clara slept, she found the small wooden bird again and tucked it into her daughter's hands as a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. 2 nights later, the storm came. It began with wind that screamed through the trees like a mourning song. The roof groaned under the weight of snow. Evelyn woke to the smell of smoke before she saw the fire. A lantern had tipped, how she never knew. But the hay caught fast. Flames leapt along the rafters, orange against black. She snatched Clara into her arms and stumbled into the snow, coughing, the night alive with heat and panic. "Help!" she cried into the wind. The flames roared louder, greedy. Through the blizzard, a figure appeared. Silas, coat flapping like wings. He reached them in moments, covering Clara with his own jacket. "Are you hurt?" Evelyn shook her head, eyes wide. "The barn, it's gone," he said. "Let it go." He pulled her and the child away as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The glow lit their faces, sorrow and relief tangled together. Clara sobbed softly against his chest. Evelyn watched the fire consume everything she owned, every piece of the life she'd tried to rebuild. When the flames died down to embers, she fell to her knees, snow melting under her tears. "I have nothing left," she whispered. Silas knelt beside her, his voice rough. "Then start from there. That's how real things are built." She turned to him, desperate. "Why do you keep doing this? You don't even know me." He met her gaze. "Maybe I don't need to. Maybe I just see what's still worth saving." His words broke something open in her. For the first time, she didn't look away. The cold no longer felt like punishment. It felt like awakening. Morning came pale and cruel. News of the fire spread faster than smoke. By noon, half the town had gathered near the ruins. Evelyn stood beside the ashes, Clara clutching her skirt, Silas at her side. Martha Hensley crossed herself and muttered, "That's what comes of sin unrepented." The sheriff nodded, self-righteous as always. "Best she move on now," he said. "Ain't right, her staying here after this." Silas stepped forward, his hat in his hands. She's not moving anywhere, the crowd murmured. Evelyn felt her stomach twist. Silas, she whispered. Don't. He ignored her. You all talk about right and wrong like you own the difference. Well, right now this woman's done more honest work than most of you. You call her nameless. Fine. Then I'll give her one. The silence that followed was so thick even the wind seemed to still. My name's Boone, he said quietly. But his voice carried across the gathering. And if she'll have it, it's hers now. Hers and the child's. Gasps broke through the crowd. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. The sheriff looked ready to speak, but no words came. Evelyn stared at Silas, the world spinning slow and bright around her. You can't mean that, she breathed. I do. He turned to Clara, kneeling so their eyes met. What do you think, little one? You like the sound of Clara Boone? The child nodded shyly, a smile trembling through her tears. Something inside Evelyn gave way. It wasn't disbelief, it was release. All her years of holding herself apart, of carrying shame like armor, cracked under the simple truth in his eyes. He wasn't rescuing her. He was naming her as equal, as worthy. She stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. Then, thank you. The snow began to fall again, soft and slow, erasing footprints and ash alike. Around them the town stayed silent. Even gossip loses breath before courage. Later, when the crowd dispersed, Silas helped her gather what little could be saved. The wooden bird was among the debris, charred at the edges but whole. He brushed the soot from its wings and handed it to Clara. See that? Still standing. Evelyn smiled through the ache in her chest, just like us. The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding. Silas offered her work at his ranch, mending clothes, cooking, keeping books when the cattle came through. The first morning she woke there, sunlight spilled across the hills, melting the last of the snow. She stood at the window, watching the world soften back into color. Clara was outside chasing the chickens, her laughter echoing through the yard. Silas appeared beside her, hat in hand. Feels strange, don't it? Warmth again. It does, she said. Almost unreal, he smiled. Real things usually start that way. They didn't speak of love. It wasn't necessary. It lived in the quiet rhythm of shared days, in the way his coat hung beside hers by the door, in the way Clara began to hum when he entered the room. The world didn't need to see their happiness to make it true. One evening, when the air smelled faintly of spring, Evelyn sat on the porch, watching the horizon burn with sunset. Silas joined her, settling into the chair beside hers. For a while they said nothing. Then she turned to him, voice soft but steady. You gave me a name, she said. But more than that, you gave me a place. He met her gaze, a faint smile playing on his lips. You did that yourself, Eve. I just pointed where the ground was solid. The sky deepened to violet. A flock of birds passed overhead, dark shapes against fading light. Evelyn closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the air no longer cold, only alive. Later, when Clara came running up with the wooden bird clutched in her hands, Evelyn took it gently and set it on the railing. Let it watch the world, she said. It's earned the view. As the first stars appeared, the old narrator's voice returned. Soft as memory. Maybe we are all waiting for someone to see us. Not the stories told about us, but the truth we keep hidden beneath the cold. And when they do, we aren't just found. We are named again. The wind carried the scent of thawing earth and distant bells. The night settled around them, full of beginnings disguised as endings. Evelyn Boone leaned her head on Silas's shoulder, the child's laughter rising like music. And somewhere beyond the hills, winter finally gave way. If this tale warmed your heart, friend, stay a while, subscribe for the next story. After all, every good winter leaves behind one more reason to believe in spring.